Okay, folks, we're going to get going here. It's high noon here in Denver, Colorado, and we're going to get started with our webinar for today. The title of it is Integrating Outdoor Water Use and Landscape Requirements into Codes and Plans. And this is part of our Breaking Down Silos, Integrating Water into Land Use Planning series. We've had 5 of them so far. We'll have some information at the end where you can find those recorded webinars. If you're here for underwater basket weaving, I'm afraid you're in the wrong spot. So yeah, please move along and we'll get going with this. I'm going to start with introducing our presenters and then our partners and going over some of the objectives. My name is Kevin Reedy. I'm the State Water Conservation Specialist at the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And our other speakers today are Rick Schultz, Water Conservation Specialist, Castle Rock Water, Lyle Whitney, Water Conservation Supervisor for Aurora Water, and Linda Dannenberger, the Planning Division Director for Mesa County Development Services. And some of our partners. We've been working with a lot of folks to either create these webinars and or get the word out for them. So in no particular order, we've got Land Use Law Center at Pace University of Law, who's helping host this webinar today, the Colorado Water Conservation Board, my organization, the Department of Local Affairs, Division of Local Government, the Colorado chapter of the American Planning Association, the Colorado Municipal League, and Colorado Counties Incorporated. So you see the speakers up there. We've got a good panel today. So why are we here? What are our objectives? So we want to look at this in terms of water efficiency and outdoor water use integrated into the land use planning process. And the folks that we've got today have done a really great job in various case studies on how they've done it in their own jurisdictions. But we want to look at addressing outdoor water use and the ways that landscape ordinances fit into long-range planning efforts. Which landscape ordinances give the biggest bang for the buck, how planners can do a better job of fitting landscape ordinances directly into the planning process, and what other municipalities are doing in the region. We've got all sorts of folks on the call today too, from local government planners to water efficiency folks, green industry people, so we've got a good cross-section, and I'm really kind of happy about that. We've had a really good cross-section for all these webinars. So without further ado, I will introduce Rick Schultz, and I'll let you take it away, Rick, and I'll be back to take some questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kevin. I appreciate it. So for those of you listening in, I don't know exactly where you're from, but I just wanted to give a really quick overview of who we are. So the town of Castle Rock, we are a full-service local government that encompasses everything from police to fire, water, development services, parks and rec, and public works. So we do have everything under one roof, which does help from a coordination standpoint. Go ahead to the next slide, Tiffany. Okay, let's go one more, please. Thank you. So as far as where we are, we're located along the I-25 corridor. We're midway between Denver and Colorado Springs. And something we think is really important to point out is that we are considered a semi-arid high desert climate, which is very, very important when you start talking about plants and landscape and irrigation requirements and all of those things, because that's critical when you understand that we are primarily a groundwater-based supply. We range in elevation almost 1,000 feet from our high point to our low point. We cover just over 34 square miles currently. The population number that you see listed there was actually as of the end of 2016. The current estimate is just over 64,000 people. So you can see just since the end of the year, we're growing rapidly. There's a lot of development going on and a lot of construction, so that's keeping us very, very busy. Go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so I mentioned that we are primarily dependent on the Denver Basin Aquifer System. That's our groundwater supply. And in spite of the fact that we are positioned quite well within the aquifer system, we still recognize the limitations, and we still recognize that we had a huge need to take care of our resources, conserve, and use water efficiency very efficiently. So go ahead to the next slide, please. I'm not going to read everything on this slide, but I think there's a couple of things I wanted to point out. That one, fairly early in the process, back in the early 90s or even the late 80s, we recognized that it was a very important thing to do, to conserve, to use water efficiently, and that was identified in our Water Resources Management Plan. And then throughout the years, we've continued to move that message forward. 2006 was our first Water Conservation Master Plan that we filed with the Colorado Water Conservation Board. That identified a conservation goal to reduce from our current per capita 165 gallons per person per day down to 135, which was an 18% reduction. We were able to not only achieve that, but we exceeded and maintained that goal. And then in our 2015 update, we identified a new goal, and that further reduced the projected demand from 122 down to 100 gallons per capita per day. If we achieve that, or when we achieve that, that will be an additional 18% reduction. Now, the other thing that's important to note there is that throughout all of this, it's obviously not sustainable. It's groundwater dependent, and we are very active in transitioning to more renewable sources. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So to that end, in April of 2013, we brought online our Plum Creek Water Purification Facility, and that was our first facility back in the spring of 2013 that allowed us to then treat and deliver renewable water, surface water. And so you can see some numbers up on the screen as far as how we've been doing. That plant has really done a good job for us, and it has some additional capacity, so we are looking at future expansion of that plant to provide even more. But the bulk of the surface water that you see there is being delivered through shallow alluvial wells along Plum Creek, and there are some future opportunities for continued expansion of that, so those percentages are going to continue to go up. Now, our ultimate goal is basically to have 75% of our water needs met by renewable surface water sources, and then only 25% continuing to come from our groundwater supplies. So we're really looking to almost reverse those numbers and have, again, 75% renewable and only 25% groundwater. Next slide, please. So again, not going to go through everything on here, but I did want to point out that, as I said in the beginning, we are a full-service organization. So this is just a very general flow chart that comes from our Development Procedures Manual, and it just talks about how things are developed from the annexation stage all the way through platting and building, and then finally issuing a certificate of occupancy if a building is in fact in place. And it's throughout this process that water dedication occurs. And the other thing that's really exciting to think about at this process through development is that we are working with new developers, new communities that are proposing to come into the town. And so we have an opportunity through the water dedication, through the development review process, to actually talk about water efficiency, to talk about water conservation and what that looks like. And we've actually got several communities underway currently where we're working with them to develop a specific water conservation plan about how that looks specific to their development. So it's really fun stuff. It's really exciting. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so again, just wanted to outline some of the highlights. Not going to read everything on here word for word, but I am going to point out a couple of things. Now, take into consideration, we're along the Denver Metro Front Range. As I said, we're on the I-25 corridor. The soil here in the Front Range is not all that great. As a matter of fact, 3/4 of what we have to deal with here in Castle Rock is all clay or rock, very little organic material. So that all plays into the fact that, as I said before, we're a semi-arid high desert climate. So when you start talking about what you want your landscape to look like, soil amendment is critical, because without the proper soil amendment, you're really going to have to pour the water to it. You can keep anything green with enough water, but that's not really the goal. The goal is, let's prepare it right the first time, put ourselves in the right position to have a healthy landscape, and certainly not only that, but an appropriate landscape for the climate. And soil amendment is definitely part of that. And that runs the gamut of parking lots, streetscapes, multifamily, also not listed, but parks and apartment complexes, schools. We work with all of those organizations to make sure that what we're doing is actually appropriate and it makes sense. And then down below that, we're talking about some irrigation requirements, and I've just listed some of the highlights for you there on the screen, but the one that jumps out at me that I think is really interesting is one of the things we require is an application rate on our sprinklers that is less than 1.25 inches per hour. And what that really means is, because of our soil conditions, because of our slope conditions, because of our elevation changes, we find that runoff occurs very quickly. And so in order to address the runoff issue, we've put a limitation on how quickly water can be applied. So if we apply water slower, we find that we're very successful in actually allowing the water to soak in before it runs off. And the other thing that we really encourage is the use of proper irrigation management techniques, like, for example, cycle and soak. So, where you put down a small amount of water and then you let it soak in before you move on. So there's just a few highlights there. I think it's important to know that 6-inch pop-up heights on sprinklers, again, just getting the sprinkler to pop up and clear the plant material so you can actually get the water to its intended target. That's very important. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So then we come up with plan review and inspection. So we do a lot of plan review. All commercial projects, all non-residential projects that come in for development are reviewed just to make sure all of the requirements are met. And that goes through a review process. It ensures compliance with the regulations. There's a series of inspections that occur, beginning with a pre-construction meeting with the installing contractors. So we can not only make sure, number one, that they're dealing with the approved set of plans. It's very, very surprising how oftentimes we meet with a contractor. He's there to install a landscape or irrigation system, and lo and behold, he doesn't have the approved set of plans. So that's the first obstacle that we have to overcome. From there, we cover soil amendment requirements, and then finally we do a final site compliance inspection prior to issuance of the certificate of occupancy or the closeout of the permit. Next slide, please. I've included this one just because this is a real-life example of a rain sensor, and I thought it was very interesting because it's installed basically where the majority of the sensor is obscured from above by the gutter, so it's not installed properly. And we've actually seen several examples of where equipment is not installed correctly. Actually, an extreme example of this is we saw an entire block in a residential neighborhood where the rain sensors were installed upside down. So, it's things like that where you would expect a little bit better results from a professional landscape contractor, and I'm not sure what happened in this case. I think it probably was a training issue with one of their crew, but we were able to catch it during the inspection phase and get it corrected. Next slide, please. Soil amendment. Again, as I said earlier, soil amendment is critical, and you can just see here, this is just an example of one of our projects that we did a few years ago. And the right-hand side of the picture to the right-hand side of your screen shows the proper amount of amendment laid down before rototilling. Then you see the equipment coming in, you see the rototilling take place. Our requirements call for 4 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet, and that is then tilled to a minimum depth of 6 inches. All the debris needs to be removed. The grade needs to be established, finish grade needs to be established before they're moving on. So that's all critical to the success of the project. And the other thing to note there is that, again, the ground is very, very hard, rock or clay in many cases, and so it does take some larger pieces of equipment. We've seen some people try and do this sort of thing with smaller equipment, and they just they're met with limited degrees of success. Next slide, please. Okay, so you put it all together, and I know this is quickly because I want to stay on time, but the question, does it work? What have we found? And just to give you a snapshot of our results, what you're looking at here is a graph of our water consumption over the years from 2007 through the end of last year. And keep in mind, what you're looking at here is not the individual consumption for each year, but this is the 5-year average. And I really like to use the 5-year average because it does smooth things a little bit, and it does help to account for some really wet years, dry years, hot years, cool years, things like that. And so the real answer is yes, it is working. And if you look at the 5-year average from last year, 2016, we're at 117 gallons per person per day. And so absolutely, we are meeting this with some good success and some good results. Next slide, please. And with that, I am done. So I'm going to turn it over to Lyle, and I think we're going to take some questions toward the end. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Lyle Whitney. As the slide reads, I am the supervisor of the water conservation in Aurora. Just to give you a very brief background of Aurora, like Castle Rock, we're a full-service organization, which again makes it a lot easier to do some of the things that we've done. We are slightly bigger. We're just east of Denver. We have a little over 350,000 people living in Aurora, and we're about 153 square miles, of which only a little over 50% is actually developed so far. So we have a lot of room to grow, which is why we're doing some of the things that we're doing. Just very quickly, there are 4 strategies that we can use to try to manipulate land use to really affect water conservation. 3 of the 4 are great for places like Denver, but we're more of a suburb, and we tend to sprawl out a little bit. We've got a lot of single-family homes, so we're really focusing on number 4. And looking at how we can change the actual landscape with the current development that we're seeing to really make that change in water use. Next slide. So I'm really going to talk about a couple things. One, I want to focus on code changes that we're currently working on and seeing, hopefully we'll see changed by the end of this year, possibly next year. Some of the code that we've got currently in place, and as well as some incentives that help our residents save water and get a little money. Next slide. So we've been working with the planning department again. In our situation, it's been very easy. They're literally one floor below us, and it doesn't take much for us just to walk down and really communicate face to face, which is always helpful. But we've been working with them for about a year now to try to reduce the turf requirements in our current code. And while we do have existing restrictions, we're looking at making them tighter to reduce that water footprint. And you'll notice through some of my slides that there are little things like in number 1 where I've crossed out tree lawn. There are little things in code that we really tried to focus on to change the mindset of our developers. So we're really trying to, so for instance, in number 1, until now, that area between the sidewalk and the street that goes by a number of various names, in our code has always been called tree lawn. And really that implies that there should be grass there, right? Like when you hear the word lawn, you think grass. So we want to remove that language from our code and call those areas streetscapes or some other word that really takes the idea of grass out of that area. We want to make our xeriscape or our water-wise landscape requirements simpler and put them on par with our turf requirements. If you were to go to our current code, you would see that all turf requirements are listed first, and then water-wise requirements listed second. And typically, if you were to just glance over them, it would appear that the water-wise requirements are more complicated. Again, it's just another hurdle for builders to get over if they wanted to do that. Next slide. So this is our proposed table. I'm not going to really read it all. I just wanted to put it in the slide to show you what we're looking at. The next couple slides we'll talk about what kind of changes we're really making. But essentially, we wanted to put the Xerox option, the water-wise option, adjacent to the turf option and actually make that the first thing that anybody that goes to code sees. Again, to try to promote that idea that water-wise landscapes in this semi-arid desert climate is a much better option or a more logical option than the turf option. Next slide. So this kind of boils down why we're making the changes. So if you look at the left, this is our current code, and there are a variety of limits or requirements based on the lot size. The problem with this is that front yards for our lots vary. So whether you're in a, so say you're in a large lot, your front yard could be 500 square feet, it could be 3,000 square feet, and there's a percentage that you can have as turf. And that's all well and good, but then when you get to the shrubs, for areas and shrubs, this is a very standard number, but again, 26 shrubs on a 500 square foot lot can look very different than 26 shrubs on a 3,000 square foot front yard lot. So we tried to make it standard and just say that there's an X number of shrubs per square foot, and we really tried to dial in that turf so that there was a maximum of 1,000 square feet. So even if you had an extremely large front yard, you were going to be limited. Next slide. This slide just shows the research that we put into this, and we were trying to figure out what would be a good minimum that we would require if you were going to go for that turf option, recognizing that turf is there to be useful. It's great for active spaces if you have a pet or if you have kids that like to play, but under a certain amount of square footage, you kind of remove that idea that it should be an active space. And so while this number is sort of arbitrary, we landed on an option between 300 and 500 square feet. And we did an analysis of our lots throughout Aurora and all of the sizes, and we really landed on 400 square feet because we felt, based on the numbers, that while some people would be affected, not a huge amount of people would be affected, like the 500 square foot minimum, and there would be enough people affected that it would make a change, whereas the 300 square foot option wasn't really going to do anything. Next slide. So if we were to implement these changes, we're looking at a potential of savings of about 60 acre feet or 31% if the development in the next 5 years is the same as the development in the previous 5 years and the same type. One of the other things that we're looking at that I haven't mentioned yet is that in Aurora, we have a lot of common spaces where there are HOAs or metro districts where there are a lot of irrigated area surrounding developments that are commonly managed. In these areas, we're proposing to remove the option of having bluegrass in that streetscape area at all. If we were to do that, again, given the predicting the same amount of development, same type of development, we're going to look at a 45% water savings just from removing bluegrass within that streetscape area. Next slide. Basically, the Xerox option changes are relatively minimal, but again, we're trying to standardize the shrubs per square foot, just like the turf option. And we want to remove the landscape plan requirement. Even though it's in code right now, planning department doesn't really enforce it, and so let's just remove that language altogether and then keep everything else the same. Next slide. So the next 5-6 slides are just kind of renderings of what a typical lot would look like if these changes were to go in place. So this is we'll kind of breeze through them, but the first 2 slides are an example of a small lot. Now, if we get the changes that we're looking for, and planning is putting them in to their comprehensive plan that they're developing right now, the small lot would potentially go from this to next slide. To this, and it really doesn't look like too much of a difference, but you'll notice that with that 40% requirement and including streetscapes in the front yard definition, homeowners will be basically forced to, or developers will be forced to choose where they want their turf. Do they want it in that streetscape area or do they want it in the yard? And we'll see a significant amount of savings. The other good thing about this is that by removing turf from that streetscape area, we'll reduce a significant amount of runoff, as you'll see in some pictures down the presentation. All right, Tiffany, can you just zoom through the next few slides? They can look at them later, but essentially it kind of it shows you what it would look like now versus later. You can go ahead. All right, so let's talk about some of the incentives we have in place. Go ahead. So in our code, back in 2014, we evaluated our tap fee structure. So the way our tap fee structure works, especially for irrigation meters, is that you pay for what you put on the ground. So there's a dollar value per square foot for high water use area, Kentucky bluegrass. There's the dollar value for low water use or water-wise landscape. So up until 2014, we only had those 2 categories. Well, it doesn't show it on the slide here, but we went from basically 76 cents per square foot for the high water use to the $2.75 per square foot, and essentially a 4-time jump as well for the low water use landscape fee. Well, as you can imagine, developers and builders really kind of freaked out a little bit. They got really concerned about the cost of their projects. Essentially, this would bring, like, say, a 400,000 square foot irrigated area project from maybe like a $200,000 cost to a little over $800,000, given the typical development patterns that we've been seeing. So that's a pretty significant jump for developers who are having to put landscape in before they can even build the first home. So what came out of that is a long discussion, about 6 or 7 months, and it was really between multiple departments as part of this joint task force. And this is where collaboration and working together really can play a huge role in developing a much better product than you would think. So because we had planning, we had parks, we had public works, we had developers, we had landscape architects, we had all of these people in the room together. And over the course of 6 months, we came up with this third option, which is we call our Z-Zone tap fee. And it's basically a temporarily watered landscape, typically native grasses, but it's native plants that don't need supplemental water once established. And because it's a temporary water use, there is no dollar value per square foot associated with this. So if a developer comes in and wants to put this in his landscape, it'll drastically reduce the cost of his project. And just so everybody knows, some of this has changed. We've streamlined it even further. It's no longer required to be a temporary tap. It's now part of the permanent tap or meter. And because of that, there's no deposit required. Next slide. And so looking at the developments that have come in, and again, this slide's a little out of date, but essentially we have about 11 developments that have come in now that have opted for the Z zone and are currently starting to put their landscapes in. And we're looking at essentially a potential savings once established of about 16 million gallons a year just from those 11 developments, about 6 million gallons per year during the establishment period, so for those first 3 years while they're still watering the landscape. So as you can see, it's greatly changed the landscape from about 50% or so of turf grass to much less because of this option, and developers are very happy about the fact that we have the Z zone option. So it's really a win-win situation. The planning department's happy because it's really changing our landscape to the way that they would like to see it, which is blending our city into a high prairie environment. Developers are saving money, and we're seeing potentially significant water conservation savings. Next slide. More on the residential side, we have also established a front yard xeriscape credit. So if a developer or the homeowner, depending on the situation, wants to put in 100% landscape in the front yard that's water-wise plant material, we'll give them a $1,000 credit back from their tap fee. Likewise, we have on our state lot our state lots, which are these properties in Aurora that range from 15,000 square feet to as much as 5 acres. We're offering a variance for those large estate lots that allows them to reduce their quote-unquote developed area to about 3/4 of an acre. And when I say developed area, I mean areas that would be irrigated through a system versus an area that they might just leave native and natural. And if we do that, they can save a significant amount on their tap fee, which is for residential development is 94 cents per square foot of the lot itself. So you can imagine if you're looking at a 2.5 acre lot, that's pretty significant. The good thing about this is the contract follows the deed to the property, so when the homeowner changes hands, water conservation will be notified, and we can go out and meet with the new homeowner to explain to them the situation and what it means, what this contract means for them. They are allowed to do a one-time change if they would like to increase their area, and they would just pay the difference in the tap fee. Otherwise, they would continue to just receive water bills, and a recovery fee component would be attached to that water bill. So if they did go over their allocation, they would just pay a little bit more, essentially paying that tap fee that wasn't paid for at the beginning to really help offset the cost of delivering water to that site. Next slide. So we're really and there's just a few slides left, just mainly pictures, but we're really looking at all of our effort is to move away from something like this. And so you can see the picture on the left. This is what we're really trying to move, and you can move away from, and you can see the amount of runoff that's running down that gutter just from those overhead irrigation system. So we're really trying to move away from that, or homes that have 90% or greater of turf grass in their lots. Next slide. Again, just pictures of things that we want to move away from. In the picture on the right, you can see the amount of runoff in that development. And again, they're meeting code requirements both on irrigation side and the landscape side, but I think we can do better. Next slide. And so we're trying to move more towards a landscape that looks like this. Go ahead. One more. Maybe one more. And so the good news is that, as you can see, it's already being practiced. So while the changes may seem drastic in our code and may seem, like it may make a significant change, the good thing is that developers are already on board and very interested. So the transition from now to the future won't be as painful as some of our elected officials and higher ups are worried about. So with that, I will end my presentation and hand it over to Linda. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for joining us. This is Linda. Tell you a little bit about Mesa County. We're located in western Colorado. Our western boundary is the Utah state line. And Grand Junction is the largest metropolitan area between Denver and Salt Lake City. Our population as a county, the whole county is probably about 150,000 at this time, and Grand Junction itself is about 60,000. Next slide, Tiffany. So we realized back, it was probably about 2008-9, that the products, the development products we were seeing were not meeting our expectations. And so some of the landscape that was done was not effective. It was not meeting the intent of the regulations. So we knew we had to embark on developing a new landscape code. And we were revising a 1983 code. So that was about 26 years of difference, a different evolution of development and water practice and everything else. So we identified what we wanted to achieve with this new code. And Tiffany, if you keep hitting that button a few times and fill out that slide, you'll see that we had a few things that we wanted to do there. Make sure that we emphasize water conservation, efficient landscape practices, and irrigation practices as well. And make sure that we had a nice looking community. Next slide. So Mesa County is high desert as well, as you've heard some of the other speakers say. And what you're seeing here is an ArcMap slide of various irrigation districts in the county. So the whole county is not covered by these districts. It's mostly the urbanizing portions of the valley. And we work with special districts. They receive their revenue from property tax. And beyond the irrigation canals themselves, it's up to either youth groups or homeowners associations to deliver the water and then charge its members for use and maintenance of the system. So it's interesting. Most of the valley uses untreated river water for irrigation. We're not like the municipalities using domestic water. Next slide. Here's another slide within those same districts showing you the layout of the irrigation canals. Grand Junction is the confluence of two rivers, the Colorado River and the Gunnison River. So we have, and those are the blue lines that you see on the map. We do have water that runs through the valley. It is high desert. We only get about 9 inches of rainfall a year in most of the county. So the irrigation canals are essential to provide water for agriculture as well as what's turned into a residential landscape too. Next slide. And as I said, we weren't very happy with what we were seeing. This is a car wash. This is a commercial site plan that you see that was built. And you know, when you're not happy with the results of development as it's constructed and completed, I think you really need to look at your regulations because you're most likely getting what you're asking for. So we knew we had to move on. Next slide. So how are we going to do this? We formed a technical review committee made up of local experts, landscape architects, landscape companies, developers, appraisers, realtors. We had a pretty diverse group that would give us feedback and involved all of these folks, including utilities and our community leaders. We didn't want to let them be the last to know. Next slide. And we had several objectives. We definitely wanted to provide flexibility. We're a western county, and folks here are conservative. They do not like the heavy hand of government, and so they respond much better to having choice. So we wanted to provide flexibility and creativity and let the owners have some say in what they wanted on their properties as well. Did not want to raise the price of landscape to developers. definitely reward water conservation, and then we needed to give information to help people. Next slide. So the first objective, the flexibility and creativity, we actually developed a point system. We found that that works well in Mesa County. If we allow points or specify a total number of points that have to be achieved for certain things in development, landscape, density, whatever it is, and then we let the property owners and developers choose how they want to achieve those total numbers of points, it really is better received. People feel like they have a choice in what's happening, and it's not so prescribed. So we do have minimum points for approval on certain aspects of site landscape, and you can actually roll over points. If you achieve excess points in one category, you can roll them over to another category, and that's also allowing flexibility. Next slide, Tim. So I just want to show you a couple of examples of creativity, and you know, if you introduce art into a desert setting, it's very effective. We can't always expect our desert environments to be lush. Next slide. And this is an actual fence. This is not a graphic that was superimposed, but this is a fence, and you can see how creative that people can get when they're inspired to do so, and when they know they have options. Next slide. So we definitely wanted to emphasize xeric and dry standards. If you remember one of the earlier slides, the map that I showed you of the irrigation districts, that did not cover the whole county. We have a big county. About 74% of it is public lands. So, but there's many areas that are privately held that do not get any irrigation water. They rely on rainfall or well water in certain areas. So we wanted to make sure that we could give them some options, and so we came up with both xeric and dry standards, and those had certain expectations. They're not zero, they're xeric. Next slide, please. So I'll show you some examples. This is xeric landscaping in a high desert subdivision. It's very attractive, and we do require that there be some water to start to establish the vegetation. Next slide. As mentioned by Kevin, I think we also wanted to reduce overspray and runoff from grassy areas, and so we actually give negative points for turf. And so this is an example in our town of one of the desired types of parking lot landscape where it's more xeric and less irrigated. Next slide. Dry landscapes are essential. We have to provide our applicants some options for when there is absolutely no water available to the site, and we have those in the county. They have to first demonstrate that there is not water available, but then we allow them with options to use primarily non-living materials and features, and a few plantings here and there. We have to make sure that they're a type that's sustainable. Next slide. So this print is a little small, but I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there are examples in this chart. This is one of our charts from our point system, and it gives ideas about what types of items could be used for a dry landscape, and you'll see all of those there. Our charts, this is an example, a graphic example of collectibles and stamped concrete, just several things. But I just want to say that our charts in our code are a bit complex, and the points are strategic. All of the points are meant to achieve a certain outcome, and so the technical committee, deliberated for quite a while as to how many points should be charged for which items and what was the desired outcome. And it's a little bit complicated. I mean, we administer it as planners, it's not bad, but we didn't worry about it being so because we knew that professionals were going to administer those regulations. We have a state statute in place that requires commercial landscape to be done by a landscape architect, as well as certain types of high-density residential development. So we weren't so worried about the simplicity of the regulations. Next slide. We did, as I mentioned, give freedom for choice, but we also try to give good information in our handbook, which we also provide to make those good choices. So here are two different types of plantings: clustered planting, which the committee determined to use less water in this type of design and be more efficient. And then there's the equal space planting that you see on the right side. So next slide will show you an example of equal space planting. So this shows you how the plants are spread out more evenly, and then the clustered style that Tiffany's showing you now in a shopping center. Those are not palm trees from Grand Junction. Next slide, please. So our second objective was to maintain cost consistency. We did not want to be, again, heavy-handed and raising the price of the cost of development here, be a disincentive for economic development in our area. So we did something that we thought was pretty transparent. We proposed several scenarios using the proposed point system and comparing it against our existing regulations. And we had a local nursery do the cost analysis for the design. So next slide will show you our first example of that. So here we laid out a potential furniture store. So a retail enterprise in that box that you see there on a limited site. And we populated the site plan, the landscape plan, with what our code required at the time before we made the amendments. And hit that button again, Tiffany. I think it'll pop the costs. Okay, there's a couple buttons, I think. So our previous code required a 20-foot buffer strip between commercial use and a use of a different type, let's say a residential use. So when we had a nursery cost out this design, it was about almost $27,000. Next slide. So then we took a scenario and we applied the point system against it, using, again, a choice of points to achieve a desired landscape. We were able to, and keep hitting that button a little bit, Tiffany, we were able to reduce the buffer area between the uses to 10 foot. That gained 1,000 square feet for the building. So that meant more space for the retailer. And most of the points that were saved, were earned by saving water. And so they used more xeric landscape. So a lot of choice. And this scenario was much less, 4,000 less than the previous under the existing code. Next slide. Scenario 2, again, we applied different types of options from our flexible point system. This scenario put more upgrades into the fence with columns, made it more decorative, and most of the planting was clustered in front versus in the buffer. And so we have options for all of that. This did come out to be more expensive, but again, that didn't matter because it was optional. Next slide. And so our last scenario, scenario 3, shows what dry landscape would come out to be. And so there were options in the tables for using boulders, native plants. We use buildings a lot as design features on a dry landscape site. So instead of having all the parking in front, we try to get the buildings located in the front of the lot instead, so that you're not having to landscape a huge expanse of parking. So they earned parking for their site design by putting the parking to the side, and then there's a decorative wall in the front that screens the parking. And the price, still less than the code that was in effect at the time. Next slide. So the third objective was water conservation, and it's required in some contexts, encouraged in others. We work with the water districts. We have several special districts that provide domestic water in the county, probably spread throughout the county. We may have about 7 or 8. Some of them will not allow outdoor water taps. They were very enthusiastic about supporting our options in encouraging the xeric and the dry landscape. Next slide. And this is an example, one more push. This is an example of not xeric landscape. So this was one of our outcomes that we did not want to see. Next slide. Detention ponds were another issue. This, I don't know if you can tell from the slide, but it's fairly deep. I'm going to guess it's about 6-7 feet deep. This detention area, and it's covered, the developer covered it with a cobble rock. And one of our engineers had to get down in the bottom and inspect the storm drain and could barely get out of this thing. And it's just, these are huge features in some of our subdivisions. We don't have storm drains everywhere, and there's a lot of detention and release that goes on with our developed properties of stormwater runoff. And so we had to figure out how to make these look more sightly, and we did that with our regulations. Next slide. So some more examples of xeric landscape. Next slide. This is a residential subdivision, same thing. Here you see more street landscape, cluster plantings with a privacy fence that had some upgrades on it, some decorative upgrades. Next slide. Okay, you've got the points. Okay. We have about 6 rural communities in Mesa County. So these are unincorporated areas that are growth centers. Many of them have sewer and water, but they're not incorporated, as I mentioned. They're just population centers for the rural areas. This is Mesa, Colorado, which is near our ski resort, Powderhorn. And this building was built as a coffee shop and an office building. And this is the way it looked before they did their landscape. Next slide. So afterwards, you see the difference. It became a very desirable place. They put seating out front for people on their way to the ski area to stop and have coffee. The highway, Highway 65, is a scenic byway. There's a lot of tourist traffic on it. And using a combination of art, you can see the horse sculptures out in front and also the plantings. It was a very nice place to be. Next slide. We also have a high desert golf course. The fairways are minimal, so there's minimal turf, and all of the landscape around it and the residential subdivisions around it use this type of desert landscape. Very attractive. So our code format, we have the tables, but the first thing to do when you look at the land development code is to identify the use. And there's a master table that talks about what use is proposed, whether it's commercial or multifamily, whatever it is, and then it specifies which tables are appropriate, subtables are appropriate to use for the various landscape requirements. And so there are subcharts. Each subchart has a minimum number of points, and then there are options within that chart. So there's standards for the materials to be used and a landscape handbook. Next slide. And then finally, there's the follow-up, the installation and maintenance. And so we consider landscape elements, amenities, like parking and signage. We do require an agreement with the developer to install the landscape, to bond for it, and to also guarantee it for a year. If there is a property owners association, then we require there to be covenants at the onset that would address the maintenance responsibility for the various landscape areas. Next slide. And that's it for me. Thank you very much for listening, and I have our website address there if you would like to look at the actual code section. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Linda. So we've got a few more minutes for questions. We went a little bit over, but I think that's okay. I've got one queued up already, and I think it's for Rick. Rick, if you want to unmute yourself. It's about your GPCD slide where you show the 5-year average drop. And the question is about population, and did the community see growth during the same period affecting that rate of reduction?
So, yes, as far as population is concerned, we definitely have increased over time. a lot of what you're seeing on that slide is, growth varies from year to year. So obviously from 2007 through 2016, which is what's covered on the slide, we didn't see the same rate of growth, but we did experience growth in every one of those years. And so I do think it's important to note that while there was growth in every one of those years, the per capita consumption did continue to decline.
Okay, great, thanks. Another question, I think this one's for Lyle. What kind of review inspection takes place to verify Z-zones aren't put on irrigation after establishment period? What happens if retrofits eliminate Z-zones? Is there a process in place to deal with those scenarios?
Right, good question. And I probably should have said something about that in the presentation. So the original way we set up the process was that these Z-zones would have to be on a temporary tap, and then at the end of the 3 years, once the landscape was established, that tap would be pulled and sealed up and could never be used again, kind of thing. This still doesn't probably 100% prevent somebody from linking to another system, but now the irrigation's actually on the permanent meter. So if they do want to water it, they can, and we thought this would actually be somewhat beneficial if we got into a severe state where they did need to add a little water just to help the landscape survive. The thing that we have in place that helps us control how much water people are going to put down is that capital recovery fee. So these properties get an allocation, an annual allocation based on the square footage and plant material that's on their property. If they go over that allocation, they will pay like a second tier rate, which is a little higher than the first tier rate. But the capital recovery fee currently, as of this year, if they went over any time between January 1st and June 30th, per 1,000 gallons, they would be paying an additional roughly $12 for every 1,000 gallons that they go over for the rest of the time. If they go over from July 1st to December 30th, it drops down to $6. But again, you can imagine that's pretty significant. I mean, even the $6 just about doubles their water bill rate if they water that area. So that's kind of our way of, discouraging people from either watering that area or converting it to bluegrass. The good thing, at least in our city, that we found is that typically once a landscape is in, people very rarely want to change it because it's expensive and it takes a lot of time. So we're hoping that between that and the capital recovery fee, people will leave the landscape the way it was. We do have it set up so that in that 3-year establishment period, we do go out every year to monitor the landscape to make sure it's looking like it's on schedule to be established within the 3 years. And then at the end of it, we meet with that property owner to, again, go over the guidelines of what it means to have that Z-zone. And then if the property changes hands, we're going to go out again and meet with that new property owner. So say the developer changes the property over to the HOA, we'll meet with the HOA board and explain to them what exactly it means that they have in their landscape. So between education and the capital recovery fee, we're hoping that it keeps the landscapes maintained where they are.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lyle. And another question, and this one's for Linda. In Mesa County, when you calculated price of landscaping in 3 scenarios, did you also have an estimate of the yearly water consumption or demand for each scenario by chance?
No, we did not do that. We did not estimate the demand, the use, or the demands. So
okay.
We focused mostly on the cost of the installation. If you notice, a lot of my presentation dealt with basically establishing the need for landscape. So we were starting at that point.
Yep. Good question. That was a good question, actually. Hey, I have a really quick question for Lyle. Is when you're establishing, like the deed to the property and all that stuff is it disclosed during the purchasing of the property as well, saying, hey, this is something that's going to come with it, or is it, is it buried in some paperwork somewhere, or how does that work exactly?
That's a good question. Chances are, I mean, unless you're paying for the property outright, it's probably going to be buried in about 500 pages. But
Yeah.
It's supposed to be, again, it gets filed with the county, so it's supposed to send up a flag. So, whether we're talking about, the estate lot variance, where that also gets recorded with the county, or the Z zone, hopefully the realtor that they're working with will see it and let the potential homeowner or the property owner understand what it means. The good thing is that our billing department also gets notified when the property changes, and that's how we will be aware of when the property changes. So we'll get out there as soon as we can to get them to understand what it means.
Great, thanks. Do we have any more questions out there in webinar land? It doesn't look like there's no more questions coming up in the message board. But so we've got these. We'll post these as soon as we finalize them and get them all edited if we have to, and then we'll post them on our Colorado Water Plan website. You'll see the link right there, and that kind of concludes our series. We've had a good turnout for this, and thanks for everybody for presenting and attending. We hope that we're going to be working on next steps for this whole process of the trainings around land use and water efficiency for the near future, and we're trying to figure out next steps and what